get started now. We've got a lot of material to cover, and we've got just about 45 minutes to get through, and we're going to open it up to questions at the end. The questions you can ask directly on the program here. We'll see them, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I'm Simon Offord. I'm an attorney here with the law offices of Peter Brewer. We're a real estate and lending law firm. Everything covered under real estate that you can think of, from residential to commercial, homeowners associations, neighbor disputes, and the neighbor disputes is kind of the key on this webinar. I'm with Jeremy Tibbets, and Jeremy's the founder of A Plus Tree Service.
A Plus Tree, yes.
And Jeremy can introduce himself real quick.
I'm Jeremy Tibbets. I'm a master arborist with A Plus, the founder. And we're also the founder and CEO of Arbor Plus, which is a technology we use to actually manage our urban forest for all our clients. And we actually license it around the entire globe. So it's used in the UK, Asia, and very popular in Australia. So it's kind of a fresh twist of actually managing our trees.
Yeah, it's a really interesting technology that Jeremy will discuss a little bit later once we've gone through some of the introductory points. We just went through a slide about legal disclaimer. We're a law firm, so we've got to do this fun little disclaimer. What we're telling you today isn't actual legal advice. Every situation is obviously different. For instance, Jeremy's going to talk about some stuff about tree roots. Well, there's general rules of thumb, but every situation is different, as I've seen dealing with these disputes, and even what one arborist says versus another one. So this isn't intended to be legal advice, but just a general overview of some of the main kind of issues that come up here, and also just understanding the urban forest and trees generally. And I think you'll get a good sense of that as we go through this. So Jeremy's going to talk to you guys first about the urban forest management. And it's something that I had actually known much about, this concept of an urban forest. And so Jeremy's got a lot of great points. And so I'm going to turn it over to him now to kind of give us the background about urban forest management.
Appreciate it, Simon. So the biggest thing that we've discovered is that people can't see the forest from all the trees. And that's a very true saying as we start digging into urban forest. It used to be that you had a native forest outside, and majority of everything we did inside the city was just a tree in the front yard. But as we continue to kind of stretch our growth as in America, this urban forest is becoming more and more of an important resource. So first of all, before we can define an urban forest, we really have to define what a forest is. And a forest is much more than just a lot of trees. It's an entire ecosystem that actually is, by definition, usually self-sustaining. It does move and change with climate over the years, but it also has a whole understory. It has the shrubs, the plant, the flora of life. And what we're really finding out is the forest that is actually below ground is just as complex and vast and critically important as the forest that we have above ground. And so when we start realizing that that's a definition of a forest from it's taking care of itself, and then you have to understand the definition of a forest of what it means to us as a species. Well, when you talk about a country's riches, you're talking about if a country has a lot of wealth, it has a lot of oil, diamonds, natural resources, and a country's wealth is also a forest. It is something that we need to harvest and resource. So as an urban forest, that has completely been neglected, that aspect of it. They said that less than 1% of urban trees is even recycled. Now, beyond just a firewood and mulching, we're talking about as a product. So as people are watching this, you can look around your office. As I'm looking around here, I see a lot of beautiful mahogany edge trimming here, but all that didn't come from an urban forest environment. Right. That came from a forest. And there's really a disconnect from here. So as we started, when we did our tech about 8 years ago, as we started seeing more and more trees coming in, this large amount of data started kind of having a discussion. Are we really maximizing the stewardship process of the trees we have here? And so as we start kind of realizing that trees, the job of an urban forester is much more of like a zookeeper, right? So the job of a zoo guy is to make sure that polar bear thinks he's in the North Pole, even though he's in San Diego. So a job of an urban forester is to make not only the trees, but the forest around it somewhat replicate or supplement what a native forest is. So, we have this huge redwood tree, and a redwood tree isn't planted in the middle of a football field in the forest. And if you ever gone camping in the redwoods, you realize there's trees all around. They don't have multiple leaders. And you definitely do not see any turf right up to the base.
Right.
In fact, you hardly ever see grass.
Right.
In fact, I could probably go out on a limb and say that grass is the enemy of almost any urban forest. It has its place. It's just its place isn't everywhere.
Right. So how many of us are living in this, what you're calling the urban forest, at least is what the kind of general understanding is?
And this is what's really fascinating. We actually, there's the modern day Johnny Appleseed, this guy, a gentleman named Tim Wanick. He's gone out and he's done a lot of research across the country, planting trees. And the most recent study is that it's now, going into 2015, 83% of the Americans live inside an urban forest.
Wow.
Now you take that, especially with the spread of the internet and the way things are growing, all of a sudden these suburbs have a much more larger spread.
Right.
Before then, you had to work in San Francisco, you had to work in Dallas, and it wasn't so much, you had more concentrated people.
Right.
Well, now this is actually, as it's spreading out and it keeps pulling, we're cutting into not only native forest lands, but we're really living in an urban forest. So we have to start kind of, being respectable and responsible with this.
Right.
But the problem is logistics, right? When's the last time you drove down San Francisco and you saw a big urban mill and pulp mill running, right?
Sure.
It doesn't happen.
Sure.
But it can be done, just like we do everything with technology, is we need to leverage our technology to not only manage our tree care, but to really maximize this urban recycling. And not everything's going to become a table and a bench, but from a mulch aspect, the trees that we have in an urban setting can be, with a little forethought, recycled right back into the soil. And so we have everything there. We just need to have a better process.
Gotcha.
And so the real lesson here today is to kind of shed some light, realizing awareness is half the battle. Yes, the trees that we have in our home or even in our communities, they have everything they need with a little bit of management to actually be put back into their own soil system. Currently, the way everything is done is you cut a tree, you chip it, you haul it off, and then somewhere way out in Stockton, you want some mulch, they're taking old pallets and they're chipping them up, grinding them, coloring them, because
Sure.
it's the easiest, and you're paying them to bring it back into your stuff to have it nice and colored, and you're really just, not only are not being, you're paying twice to actually move mulch out and bring mulch in, but you're not really, you have everything there that you can actually put right back into the ground.
Right. And so one of the issues, it seems to be, is that we live in pretty dense urban neighborhoods, right? So we have disputes that come up because of the way that people just want their land to be a certain way, and they don't care about the actual greater biodiversity of the trees or the greater urban forest. So what are some of the techniques that we can kind of use to deal with these issues?
Well, there's a lot of issues, and like I said, it goes back to the first comment that the tree underground is almost 3 times tree above ground.
Right.
A lot of and I know you guys deal with it, and I deal with it all the time as well, is this tree's dropping leaves on my property. This limbs are dropping leaves, touching my building, and roots. And so there's a lot of, I know we're going to go into different parts of that, but as a fun little fact, when you see a tree's canopy in a native forest, the roots of that tree grow 3 times the length of that furthest limb.
Right.
So you think the neighbor right next door is messing you up. Actually, the neighbor across the street's roots are in your yard, whether you like it or not,
Sure.
to some extent.
Sure.
It's just not as evident. So once we realize that a tree is probably it's the biggest, I heard it's the biggest creature we have on earth is a tree. And it's pretty much the most public thing you can have. Even if you grow a tree in your backyard, once it gets past that roof line, the whole community enjoys it.
Yep.
So we have to have practices that not only protects plumbing and property lines, but that actually works well together.
Right.
And the more you know, the easier it is. And there are, we have a lot of methods that actually help the trees stay somewhat contained. And there's even a lot of breakthrough on growth hormones, where you put this on the tree and it redirects the tree's growth over the next 5 years, instead of the woody roots to the hair-like roots. So a great case of going, this tree is perfect right now, but if it gets an ounce bigger, I have to remove it.
Right.
And then I, wreck my shade of my parking spot. Well, now you can supplement that. And that growth hormone is what a tree naturally does in a forest environment in extreme drought.
Gotcha.
So once again, you're tricking a little bit, but
Sure.
you're working within the tree's biology. Once again, we don't want to just chemical everything, but there's some cultural practices, which
Right.
you can do with watering and health. But then there's also practices that you can supplement in that goes down to more what's the word I'm looking for? Synthetic approach.
Sure. Okay. And so it seems like, in our neighborhoods years ago when you had developers going out and building suburbs, they wanted to plant specific kind of trees that might not have been quote unquote native trees to California. So can you talk a little bit about this issue of native trees versus non-native trees and how over time that's changing?
Great question. So you actually brought up two questions here. One, you brought up what the developer
Sure.
plants,
Yeah.
right, which is completely native, non-native. He has his own set of criteria, and then a native forest. So first of all, there's some different opinions on here, but what's native now wasn't native, perhaps 500 years ago.
Yeah.
The temperatures climb up and down. I was talking to a gentleman, Matt Ritter, who's at Cal Poly University, and he was saying that we should start planting almost the thought of exotic eucalyptus. Now, not the giant ones we have
Sure,
around here,
sure.
because if global warming keeps happening, we're going to be more Baja California than a Mediterranean climate.
Right.
So, yes. So first of all, when people are like, it's not native, it's not native. Well, there's so many eucalyptus here now, you might as well just forget it. Eucalyptus are part of California's landscape, whether you like it or not. So I'm not so much a stickler on native and only now. It's
Sure.
hanging on to the past. We got to move forward. Okay, so part of that, though, is what what tree is in the right tree in the right place?
Got it.
Okay, and you do not want a tree that as soon as you plant it, it's got a whole host of problems, and you're going to have it on life support and chemically treated.
Right.
Personally, I'm extremely sensitive to chemicals. Well, not personally on my skin, right? But I mean, like, I want to be as least as possible of really being a good steward of not trying to pollute our soil.
Sure.
So we want to work with a tree that actually has the least problems. Well, what do we have? Because in the 1970s, they thought there were some really great species. They're like, these Monterey pines, they're the perfect tree. Well, oops, that was a big mistake. Now that we're tons of fire blight, pitch canker, beetles, they're constantly being removed.
Right.
Oh, fruitless pear, bulletproof. Well, until fire blight came in, and now you're wiping them all out. One of the reasons that these disease and pathogens spread is because they make up a huge monoculture. Now,
Sure.
Monoculture, for those Latin lovers, mono being one, culture meaning, well, you're a Latin lover, you should know that one. The idea here is that you don't want to have the same species. So when you have the same species, not only can you spread disease much more, even if it's your tree or not. The average pest goes a mile radius.
Sure.
That's its life expectancy. So you think, oh, my neighbor across the street hasn't cut its pine tree down. Well, a mile's a long way to make sure everyone's treating their tree. It's called impossible.
Yeah.
So from what we're actually trying to do is having a healthy forest not only keeps each species less than 20%. So if you have 100 trees, you should have at least 5 species that make up that forest.
Okay.
But there's an age diversification here too. If all the trees are planted in 1960, it's a beautiful lush forest, but depending on the species, they might be all coming to their end of their age cycle.
Right.
So you need to have somewhat of a diverse culture from a species point of view, as well as an age point of view. And then the next step is even your understory. Not everything needs to be, lilacs. You need to mix it up because there's a communication going on there. And the more biodiversity that we have, the healthier our forest is. And you know who knew all this was all our great-grandfathers knew this. All the farmers. This isn't new technology, new science. Rotating your crops. I mean, these are all terms we hear, and it was to keep the soil fresh and that biodiversity moving out.
Right. So if someone is looking to plant a new tree in their yard because they have to remove one or they're just developing some new land, what do they need to know before they make that decision in terms of if they were going to come to you and say, Jeremy, look, I've got this new lot, we want to put some trees in, what would you look at to help them make that decision? Good question. Well, so there's three things when you're actually looking at, picking a tree. So there's, first of all, from a homeowner's point of view, there is very much what does the homeowner want this tree to accomplish? Sure. The tree, it has to serve a purpose. Right. Shade, do I want to keep solar, screen, and color. So you have to take that into consideration. Yep. But from an arborist point of view, I have to look at and I go, okay, I know how many trees of this particular kind are in this area. Right. So a lot of people call and go, hey, I drove to the mall and I saw these really pretty trees in the median and I want 4 of them. Well, unfortunately, that's what everybody says. And those, crepe myrtles might have powdery mildew or problems.
And so we can still meet those requirements. There's tons of species in here, but we have to go outside the box.
Right.
Sometimes the difficulty is your nursery selection. The nursery wants what's more popular, and Home Depot might have a good sale, but where is that product coming from? So we try to cultivate as local as we can, so the tree is more, used to these systems. Yep. And planting is an art. It's not just dig a hole, stick a tree in the ground. It's preparing that room, digging 3 times the length, the amendments.
Sure.
We put in biocarbon to make sure it can actually soak up the water. And once the tree gets established, well, then you're money ahead. The other component is right tree, right place. This is for my PG&E peeps. Do not plant a giant redwood underneath your power lines, right? Duh. So you're going to have serious problems right there. And do not put a giant redwood, perhaps if you have all of 3 square feet in the San Francisco area, right? That's going to be problems for your neighbors. And let me ask you this. This is a good question that goes in your neighborhood. What are the legalities when somebody does plant a eucalyptus right near my neighbor's fence foundation where it's going to be problems?
Right. Well, that's a perfect transition, because now that we've got a good understanding of this idea of the urban forest, how does that interact with some of our clients and the issues that they're seeing? Well, one of the big ones we get is tree roots, right? So the 3 ones we get are tree roots, tree pruning issues, if you want to prune your neighbor's tree because the branches are overhanging your yard, and lastly, leaves. Leaves falling in people's yards can be a nuisance. So if someone plants a tree, a great big eucalyptus or redwood right next to your property, what's going to happen? Well, eventually the roots are going to start coming into your property. And what can that mean? Well, in extreme situations, it can mean the foundation gets damaged. We don't really see that much, and the arborists I speak to say that's pretty rare. But what's more common is if you have a thin patio, concrete patio, those get pulled up a lot. Sidewalks are constantly getting pulled up from roots. And even sometimes when you get surface roots, the surface roots can be a nuisance for people, tripping over them, and people are particular about their yards, and they don't want to see these roots that are up on the surface, and it takes away from their perfect, pristine yard, right?
Perfect world.
So those are the situations that come up, and so how do we deal with that? Well, typically the person is going to go to their neighbor, and in a perfect world, they go to their neighbor, they talk about it, they work it out, they figure it out. But in order to figure out, they've got to look at, okay, well, can I just cut these roots, or is that going to cause the tree to fall over? And the problem is that if you do that, if you have a tree that's your neighbor's tree, but the roots are in your yard, you go out there and chop the roots, and you kill the tree, or the tree falls over, that's your fault now. It doesn't matter that you don't own the tree. You've caused that damage. So the first thing you really need to do is you need to consult with an arborist and figure out, okay, what are my options here in terms of dealing with these roots? Do I have any options? Is it a root barrier? Can I cut the roots? And so, Jeremy, let me ask you, is there kind of a general rule of thumb? And I understand that every situation is different. You got to look at the whole urban forest. You've got to look at the particular tree, whether we're looking at anchor roots versus
like a
fibrous root, something like that. So in general, though, is there a kind of a general rule that you can look at?
So we already kind of made one general rule that in a native forest, the roots grow 3 times the length of the furthest limb. So that means every street repair has some form of damage to roots, whether they realize it or not.
Sure.
So there are general rules that an arborist abides by, but once again, nothing's perfectly grown underneath. So, in the nice Instagram, there's a tree trunk and the roots are 360 degrees perfectly around.
Right.
We went out to a walnut orchard, and which is, completely consistent environment, same tree, same planting. And we used an air spade. And what an air spade, this is how we usually do a lot of root litigation, is essentially was used for mines underground. So it's compressed air, you pull the trigger, and it makes a hole, but it won't even hurt the smallest hair-like root. Really interesting stuff. And so what we did is we air spaded 10 different walnut trees, and sure, of those 10, 5 of them were more, textbook, only 5.
Right.
And then one had one complete root like a kickstand.
Wow.
So as an arborist, if I didn't know better, they go, hey, we just want to cut one root. And if I was on that tree, I'd be like, well, that meets within our textbook, but you would take out 90% of that tree's roots and adjust the stability of it. So first of all, you need to know your surroundings from an urban forest manager, but when you look at the tree as an arborist, there's only general rules. So one general rule, which is on the slide here, talks about diameter. And this is something, once again, very textbook from a consultant arborist.
Sure.
So if you have a 10-inch tree, you have a critical root zone, which is usually 1 times that. So you cut anything in there, you're going to have issues. You probably should remove the tree. So 10-inch tree, go 10 inches out. That's a big no-no.
Sure.
You start getting actually within 3 times that, you're still in the critical zone, and you need to start having a consultant. So 10-inch diameter tree, you start going up 30 inches. Once again, it's not that far, considering that the tree roots are 50 feet away. But anything outside that 3 times the diameter, and diameter is the diameter of breast height. So ISA got together and they said the universal breast height 4.5 feet. I don't know how they came up with those studies, but whatever. There it is. So now,
and so breast height is used by arborists, and a lot of the cities use them for their regulations about what's a protected tree and all that.
Exactly. So you don't measure at the base, you measure at the trunk. So in this example, a single trunk, 4.5 feet above the ground. The diameter, that lets you know if you need a permit, all kinds of information's about that. So if it's a 10-inch tree, you go out 30 inches. If you start pushing past the 5 times it, you're usually safe. And, you know, if there is root cuts, typically you fall within that, your due diligence. It's when you start going within that root zone that you might need to do some further investigation. And that next step is we bring that tool out, expose all the roots, not just the sides you're cutting. We would want to cut clean and, you know, make sure that we can actually work with the tree and put that TGR on a tree. And I'll put a little thumbtack in here that says about the roots growing on the surface. Once again, in the forest floor, you take a shovel, you can dig a hole real easy, yet you need a jackhammer in our setting. And so the tree roots, they don't critically think. I get calls all the time. The tree roots growing towards water. The tree has no idea that there's water in those pipes. What happens is they trenched a line. They loosened up the soil. Then they stuck the water pipes there. And the roots growing, it's like hard. Oh, opening, and it goes right. So when I have foundational problems, the reason typically roots aren't, they don't cause foundational problem is you're holding up a house. It's pretty solid concrete. But as that house is older, sometimes there's a little hole in the foundation. And the tree root, the little hair-like root, hook a right leg, and as it expands, then it does its damage. So because they just don't have anywhere to go. So what we're finding is, back to that forest floor, the more mulch and leaves that you can condition that soil below grade. If you want, you know, in different areas like Modesto, trees that are right near houses are causing no damage because the soft soil is so deep that the roots are like 6-8 feet down. Now, you read an ISA arborist book, 90% of roots are in the top 12 inches of soil. But in a forest, they do go deeper and they're not causing as much conflict. So it goes back to a cultural practice, choosing the right species, the right environment. You can avoid a lot of these problems. But once they're there, well, then when you have to cut, these are the general parameters. Then you need an arborist.
And so one thing that oftentimes comes up in these disputes for us is the owner of the tree wants to keep the tree. They're saying, I've had this tree here. It's been here since I owned this house in 1975. I'm not letting this tree go. It's giving me shade. I like to look out at it and enjoy it. My kids swung off of it. You know, the whole 9 yards, right? So the question then becomes, okay, is there a way to keep the tree? And normally the person that's got the roots in their yard and they're tripping over them and their concrete's falling apart says, no, we don't want the tree. And the owner says, okay, well, there's another option, a root barrier. How do you determine if a root barrier is an appropriate mechanism? Is there again a kind of rule of thumb, or is it real specific to the type of tree, the type of ground, and all that?
So a root barrier, you know, it goes back to once you have more of a working understanding of how a tree biology works, you understand the thought process behind it. The idea is the tree roots want to do the best, the path of least resistance. So when you cut a root, when you guys top a tree, and topping's a big no-no, you cut the top off a tree, you get like 6 or 7 sprouts off of it. Well, the exact same thing happens underground. You cut a root, you're like, here's my new sidewalk, and you cut the root right here. Well, all of a sudden, I'll get in the camera. Oh, this way. Here we go. All of a sudden, boom, 5 new roots are growing right towards where you wanted to avoid it. So unless you take that next step and condition the soil to make a U-turn, then the new roots will grow that direction. The idea of a root barrier is they will put this nice little 16-inch, sometimes 12-inch thin little plastic, and sometimes they're laced with herbicide. So the root touches it and it withers away. frankly, they're more beneficial for younger trees.
Mhm.
I do not push them a lot because they have ups and downs as
Right.
far as what they do.
And whether they're effective and all that.
And correct. And also, remember what I said. When you dig to put in the root barrier, you're loosening the soil.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
all of a sudden, I loosen the soil below the root barrier. What do the roots go? Whoop,
Right.
under and over.
Right.
So there's a lot of mixed studies on this
Sure.
particular part.
Sure.
It goes back to really having a more appropriate health species for it. Now, I'll just do one more thing. There's two types of roots typically.
Okay.
There's anchor roots. Those are the big ones that are messing up everyone's property.
Right.
And then there's the fibrous roots, the little hair-like roots. Now, they're not causing any problems to anybody except maybe your sewer if they get in there, right? But those are the roots that make that help the tree absorb water, the nutrients. So when we put a TGR on it, or a growth regulator, a tree growth regulator,
Yep.
you're blocking the gibberellum hormone that says quit growing so much to the woody roots and redirect it to the hair-like roots. So they're not causing the damage which you get the phone call for.
Right.
In fact, you need more of those to keep the tree healthier.
Got it. Okay, great. So how this comes into play for us is then if someone's roots are actually causing damage, they're pulling up the concrete patio, let's say. Well, is there some sort of legal remedy there? Well, there is, and that's how we get these disputes. And it's just a general nuisance theory. A tree's roots can be considered a nuisance to the person that's being affected. So you then have to look at the scenarios, whether the tree can be removed. And a lot of times, whether the tree can be removed isn't just a decision between neighbor A and neighbor B. They've then got to go to the city or the county. And the city or the county, each city has different regulations and rules. They look at most times the breast height. If the breast height is a certain diameter, it's considered a protected tree, and you can't remove a protected tree without a permit. You've got to get approval. Certain types of trees are protected. Live oaks are protected in a ton of cities, for instance. So you've got to look at that before you can just go out there and say, okay, neighbor A says, I want the tree gone. Neighbor B actually says yes. Well, okay, let's make sure the city says yes as well. And the cities will say yes in certain instances, but each city has their own arborist, and their own arborist is going to take a look at the tree,
Correct.
Figure out if this is a tree that should be removed. If it's causing damage, a lot of cities do say yes, but you've got to go through that whole process before you can just start hacking down trees, for good reason, obviously. So the next issue that we come up on is pruning trees. And so what do we mean by pruning trees? Well, the canopy, right? So the tree trunk can be on neighbor A's yard, but neighbor B has got branches hanging over their property, and it's causing all of shade issues that they don't want, or they're afraid that the branches are going to fall off and go through their roof. Or they just don't like them, and you just got a cranky neighbor that just doesn't like the idea of some trees being over their property. So the first question on all of these issues actually is to determine who owns the tree, and this is a legal determination. So Civil Code sections 833 and 834 deal with tree ownership. And basically, who owns the tree is dictated by the location of the trunk. So let's pull up this slide real quick here. And so a lot of times, you don't really actually know where the property lines are, and this is a common misconception. People come into our office all the time and say, hey, the tree's on that side of the fence, so it has to be my neighbor's. Well, fences are often in the wrong place.
Right.
I can't tell you how many times we say, well, let's get a survey done, and the survey shows something completely different. That, the fence can be a few inches to a few feet off, and then all of a sudden you actually own that tree that you thought the neighbor owned. So if we're getting into a full-blown dispute here, getting a surveyor is kind of necessary in a lot of these cases to figure out who owns the tree. And why is that important? Okay, because the tree owner is responsible for the damage it causes. Now, the tree owner also has their rights. So if a tree's branches are hanging into your yard, or a tree's roots are going into your yard, it doesn't mean that you can just freely chop them off because, hey, they're now in my space. You can cut them, but the key is you have to be reasonable and you can't damage the tree. Now, how do you do that? Well, the first way is to talk to someone like Jeremy or an arborist to say, okay, let's talk about these roots. How far are they from the property? Can I cut them? Is there other ways to deal with them? Or let's talk about the canopy. Is there some safe method to deal with this that's not going to kill the tree? If you hack off half the canopy, that's probably not good for the tree. And so you can't do that. You can't just have your gardener who has no tree expertise go out there with a chainsaw, climb up there and start hacking things. Otherwise, you're going to get sued potentially. Now, if you get sued, what does that mean? Again, this applies to both um, roots and branches. And so what happens if you get sued? Well, there are some serious damages. And in the last 10 years, we've had about 3 cases that have come out that have scared me to the point where I'm never cutting my neighbor's trees, because Civil Code Section 3346 and Civil Code Section 733 talk about what those damages are for trees. And the value of the tree can be doubled if it's just a run-of-the-mill, sorry, I cut the tree without knowing what I was doing, or tripled if it's considered malicious. So you're mad at your neighbor, you just start cutting their roots and it kills the tree. So how do you value the tree? Well, the courts have looked at lots of different ways to do it. And frankly, in one case, the court might use one valuation. In another case, the court might use another valuation. But they'll typically get some sort of expert witness in. And the experts have been saying these trees, mature trees, range from $20,000 to $40,000 in value. Double or triple that, you've got a $100,000 claim against you now for cutting someone's tree. So it's really scary stuff. That's made me paranoid about dealing with any trees in my property, because the idea of simply cutting some roots or cutting some branches that you don't like could end up being a $100,000 claim is a real scary legal issue.
Correct.
And so there isn't any hard and fast rule on this. So if you're going to be cutting the trees, speak to your neighbor first. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we have clients come in and say, my neighbor's tree is causing me all these issues, and they're not doing anything about it, and I'm not happy about it. And I say, okay, well, what did the neighbor say? Silence. Go talk to the neighbor. I mean, your neighbors, you got to live with these people. So that's the first advice I give people. At least get the conversation going. It's not necessarily the best thing to have a chest beating letter coming from your attorney before you've even spoken to them, because they might be perfectly reasonable. They might say, hey, we hate that tree too, let's get rid of it, or that tree's not right and we spoke to an arborist already and they said we've got to do. You don't know those answers if you don't talk to them. So that's the first thing, is talk to them. And then if that doesn't work, well, then that's when we can get arborists involved, surveyors involved, and we can get involved to try to help work it out and hopefully avoid some big costly lawsuit or big costly damage, claims damages. So,
and Simon, you mentioned something offline to me about the definition of a trespass is
Sure.
usually the 3 years before. If somebody builds a fence on your property line, you have 3 years to complain or you
Right.
lose that. However, with trees, that nuisance that you mentioned, roots or not, is growing. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so that's the point. It's a great question, because in general, there's this thing called the statute of limitations under the law, and it says you have to bring a lawsuit within a certain amount of time. Well, tree roots are a little different because they keep growing, and so every day they
New
grow
problem.
a little more. So it's a new problem. It's an extra inch higher, and so in theory, these tree nuisance claims are kind of unending in terms of their statute of limitations. Now, there is another legal theory called latches, and latches says you can't just sit on your rights and not do anything about it. So that one doesn't have a specific number of years, and that's where we get into that gray area where it's like, well, you could be okay under the statute of limitations, but a judge could say, hey, you waited way too long. Now it's a much bigger problem because you sat on it and didn't do anything, so they could still deny your claim that way. So it is always good to kind of address it as quickly as you can, but sometimes I'll have clients come in and say, look, the neighbors said that this tree's been here for 30 years. The roots have been there all this time. So because you didn't bring it 27 years ago, you're out of luck. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So don't be intimidated by the fact that the tree's been there for a long time.
Correct.
Great question. Okay, let's move on to leaves. We're buzzing through here. We were already at almost 40 minutes. So let's quickly touch on leaves. Leaves can also be a nuisance, right? So if your leaves are falling into your gutter and blocking up your gutters, or just falling into your property, some people don't like
Sorry about the technical glitch. We now have the audio back up. We're going to have a little quick fix for you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I could repeat the total untapped wisdom that I just said before we had the cutout. Okay, so I believe the question, we were talking about leaves.
Right.
So hopefully we're all good on that. Everyone can hear us now. So leaves mock the forest floor. Even the leaves, when they drop, they don't get raked up. And also, to take it a step further, even broken limbs from a tree in the forest do not get, they do not get raked up either.
Sure.
In fact, it's a very crucial part of how pure the even fallen trees are as they break down onto the soil and the biodiversity.
Right.
It's amazing anything grows in a lot of our urban environments.
Mm-hmm.
It's a miracle. So we need leaves, but there's other ways to actually mock that up. So it goes back to leaves are part of, when we chip a tree, typically a tree that has the leaves involved and the cut up wood, that's the healthiest product right then and there. Now, there's methods to regrind it to make it look a little bit more cosmetic, but that's the good stuff.
Yeah.
The wood chips that are coming outside, like I said, the Stockton, typically even the colored mulch, it's a product, but you're losing about 90% of that biodiversity breakdown.
Sure.
So if you bring all the leaves, and they have a place, I understand you can't just leave them everywhere.
Right.
But when you actually have a good urban forest plan, you know how much mulch you're making from one tree, and you can put it in different parts of your soil.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you're eliminating how much fertilizer I got to keep shooting into the ground, which over the years, our toxicity level in our soil has kept getting higher and higher and higher, and the pH scale gets higher and higher. So now it's getting to the point where our soils are so alkaline that even you can have all the water and nutrients in the ground, but there's no cationic exchange going up and down.
Right.
So people are like, trees suffering, need more fertilizer, need more water. Not really. You need to adjust your soil and keep that magic method down there. So this is a bigger issue. Yes, in a best case scenario, you'll leave it all there and don't touch anything.
Right.
It's not always applicable, especially we do mainly commercial tree care.
Mm-hmm.
We have to plan this over HOAs, apartments, and they have their own slip litigation, I'm sure, where somebody slips on the leaves when it's wet. Well, now they have their lawsuit. So it's a thorough problem, and it goes back to us leveraging technology to really do that.
Yeah, and just like with the roots and with the branches, leaves can be considered a nuisance. So some people might overlook the urban forest idea and be more concerned about their yard only and the leaves being in their yard. And so we do get lawsuits on that. And again, that's not as big of a deal as we see in the pruning issues and the roots issues, but it's normally one component of those claims. So sometimes we'll have people complain that, look, this tree, A, its roots are causing damage, B, its branches are all hanging over my yard, and that means that the leaves are also falling in my yard. Well, so then is that part of the nuisance claim? It can be. It certainly can be, because it's something that's impeding in your quiet enjoyment, which is the legal catchphrase of your land. So then again, that's when you need to talk to the arborist and figure out, is there some way to this and what's the best way? And hopefully you can get to an answer that way without having to litigate over it. But if you can't, then that's where we come in. So that covers the spectrum of the issues in terms of the legal issues that we looked at. Jeremy's going to talk to you guys a little bit about something that's very interesting. It's some technology that they are working on about urban responsibility and understanding how all this stuff interacts, because a lot of what we spoke about is not just neighbor A and neighbor B, right? It goes to a bigger picture. And so how do we deal with that?
So we mentioned pruning, and I know that could be its own webinar right there, but it goes back to knowing what you've done instead of just waking up, cutting this tree and forgetting about it. Technology allows us to actually keep a larger database. So we really saw the need of this, and I think we made our own tech that we use for our clients called Arbor Plus, and we license it. But what was really allowed us to do, as I put a little thumbtack in pruning, is when we prune and we start realizing that this urban forest is a product, the way I prune a tree drastically affects if I can recycle this tree into a product later on.
Sure.
So it's still mimicking the forest floor. You're still being conscientious of health, structural, and safety, and you want to develop that central leader. But you take that little extra insight, and it goes into our tech. You go from maybe, if you were removing 100 pairs, maybe you'd be able to recycle
10 of them to being able to perhaps mill out 80 to 90 of them.
Sure.
So this is having a larger view. And really, in our clientele, we don't have the ring, I want my tree to be removed.
Right.
It's we put all their forests inside our technology, and then it gives us a better, not only a better able to make decisions, but allows us to have, how much mulch they'll be making,
Right.
where to apply that mulch, how many of these trees that are infected that we can actually harvest and actually make a cool product out of. So let me ask you a question. So if I've had a tree and my neighbor and I have a dispute, the tree is causing root damage, it's determined the only remedy here is to remove the tree. Okay. Our tree company comes out, tree service company comes out, cuts the tree down. What do they do with the tree typically? All right, so typically, if it's small enough, let's say if it's under 18 inches and they have a halfway decent chipper, they're just going to chip it all and put it somewhere. Okay. Typically, that's somewhere, well, it could be on the side of a freeway, right? But it also sometimes it's just either in a waste management facility where they will do something with it. The problem is we're taking it off-site.
Right.
Or they just want to leave it in your front yard, which can be a nuisance.
Right.
So this is a huge opportunity of going, if we can see how much and plan ahead, that mulch can actually be utilized throughout the whole forest floor, which is beyond just the trees.
Sure.
The other thing is it's just cut up and firewooded.
Right.
So about 2 years ago, we opened up a furniture making company because we started getting so much tech, the trees out of the technology we have.
Right.
So every job we do, we have a photo, we have the GPS coordinates, we have the history of the tree, and all of a sudden now we can connect it where it's educating the public as they're sitting down at that sushi restaurant or on a bench. They can type in and actually see where that wood came from.
Very cool.
So really, our vision at A+ is to inspire urban forest management throughout our industry in America's urban communities, and we do that by leveraging our technology to improve tree care and to maximize this urban recycling.
Sure.
And in a day where people want to know the name of the chicken they're eating, they really, really, really want to know where that tree comes from.
Right.
And half these legal disputes, it's very emotional. Yes, talk to your neighbor. Half the problems get away. Talk to your neighbor. But you have to understand that you want to cut your neighbor's tree down, and they grew up their granddaughter there.
Right.
Sometimes the tree does need to be removed. It's a healthy part of the forest.
Yep.
But if that can actually be brought back into and utilized throughout the community, and for ours, it connects to their Facebook so they can check in.
Right.
It takes a much, much more holistic and healthy approach. We call it After Plus. There's A+, Arbor Plus, and then After Plus.
Gotcha.
Play on words, really cute. Yeah, I know. But it's amazing what this product looks like. And the stories it tells, it's really bringing a lot of attention to this and brought a lot of, even with the cities, they love it. So we're the first to actually really utilize this beyond the hobbyist level because we have the tech and the furniture making company, and we connect it all, and we already manage typically our clients' forests.
Yeah, it's a great idea because a lot of times that is the problem that comes up is people get attached to their trees. If you've lived in the same house for 30 years and you've looked at that tree every morning while you're drinking your coffee, it's hard to see it go away. So I think it's a great tool that I can offer when I've got the client that wants the tree out to say, look, you can keep this tree. It's just going to be in a different form. It's going to be in a different form, but you can still have those memories. And look, we'll plant a new tree there that's the right tree for this particular environment and all that. So you're getting this new tree, and you're still keeping your old tree in just a different form. I think it's a fascinating way to deal with these problems because I entered real estate law thinking I'm not doing criminal law, I'm not doing family law. It's not going to be this incredibly emotionally draining thing. Okay, I've learned that real estate is maybe more emotional and draining. Yeah, with people get committed, their houses are everything. It's the biggest investment in your life. The yards, the trees, everything. There's an emotional impact on it, and so I think that's a great way for it to be dealt with.
And wood's the one thing that if you treat it can last centuries. It's funny. The same tree biodegrades in 20 years, but if you mill it and put a product. I mean, we have benches and tables that are, from the Renaissance age. So it's an amazing product.
Very cool. Okay, everyone, we're at the 50-minute mark, so we've gone over a couple because of that technical difficulty, but we've got some questions. So I apologize, I'm not looking at you because I've got to look at the screen here. First question. Appreciate the discussion around the urban forest, but in my city, San Jose, that entails having to deal with municipal codes, especially around plantings in the parking strip in front of my home. I'm responsible for the stewardship of those trees. Some time ago, the city actually planted an apple tree in my parking strip. Now that it is mature and bears fruit in abundance, the city has cited me to cut the tree to a 14-foot clearance on the street side and 8 on the sidewalk. Since the 14-foot requirement is about as tall as the tree currently is, trimming it to that height will result in serious misshapen and disfigured and potentially lead to its demise. What are my options here since the codes are in direct conflict with the health of my urban forest? Well, I think that's a question that both Jeremy and I can touch on. It's a great question, and it is a problem because cities have rules, okay, and cities have ordinances. And getting cities to change those rules or ordinances or consider something else, if it's not written on the law, they don't want to touch it. And so sometimes dealing with cities is very difficult. You can go through permitting processes. You can go through appeals. But the cities are governed by what their municipal code says, not always by what, hopefully there's no city people here, but not always by reason or what makes the most sense. So there might be ways that you can convince the city that this isn't the right approach. But the first thing the city is always going to say is, well, what does an arborist say? Right. So that's the kind of time where you talk to an arborist, and the arborist might say, this is going to kill the tree, or this is a terrible idea, or the tree is just fine. And if the arborist can convince the city arborist, sometimes you can get some action that way. But unfortunately, those municipal codes, they're written down, and the cities are very reticent to go away from them.
I can't believe the city planted an apple tree, but maybe that's to feed the hungry initiative. Who knows?
There you go. Okay. Yeah, so obviously someone might not have been thinking at the time they did it, and now it's unfortunately your problem, but there are ways to address it. You just got to push hard back on the city and get some expert opinion to tell them why they're wrong.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Could you give guidance on planting new trees? How far away should they be from houses, driveways, sidewalks, light poles, other trees, water mains, gas lines, sewer lines, etc.?
Sure. So I get that question a lot. Once again, you have to first of all, there's a lot of guidelines to actually planting a proper tree. So I'll just give you some basic ones that you could almost Google. If you want to, if it's a 15-gallon tree, you want to dig 3 times the hole. They're saying put a $10 tree in a $100 hole. The idea is the prepping of it and actually making sure that you're keeping it above grade so all the water doesn't just sit down at the base of it. Sure. Step 1. So simple steps are plant the tree a little higher above grade. Okay, it will shrink down. Don't freak out. Dig a bigger hole so the new roots can anchor in. See, a lot of times people plant these trees so perfectly that you come by it 5 years later and the tree's bigger, but you just moved the whole tree and the whole. It's just that you just put it in a bigger pot, right? Especially with our clay soils we have in the Bay Area. So you really need to kind of mechanically loosen up that soil, do some amendments. But what typically we do as best practices, we actually not only raise it up, dig a larger hole, make sure that the watering's set up, but then we'll actually put in, some biocarbon to kind of help attract and filtration of the water. And a couple other little tricks, and use mulch. Once again, those wood chips on top helps break down. That's the food for all the magic. Once the tree gets anchored, it needs less and less supplementation of water. So that's key. Now, as far as where and what kind of tree and how far from the gas lines and all that, typically you don't want to put a tree right where you know you're going to have problems. Right. And if you do have to have a tree, you're going to want something a little smaller. If you're going to have a larger tree, have the room for it, right? Again, don't shove a polar bear in a chihuahua cage, right? It's not going to be very happy. And then there's a part of, when you think of a forest, you have, even when you think of your own private yard in the backyard, you can have that patriarch tree and then smaller shrubs and trees underneath it and understory. So really, we should be planting from a center point and kind of stretching out, which is what a forest is, not random large trees and turf all around it. Right. The only landscape that's native in would be like a valley oak scenario where you see it sprinkled across, and then it's applicable.
Gotcha. Another question here. It's a great question that I get all the time. The question is, how can I protect my view if the neighbor's tree is growing too tall? Always get that one.
I have a neighbor's tree that's growing too tall.
Yeah.
So yes, hopefully he doesn't see this webinar.
No. So it's a common problem, right?
Now, under California law, you don't have any inherent right to a view or to air or to light. So what does that mean? Well, if there's no other mechanism in place to protect your view, you might be out of luck. Now, are there other mechanisms? Yes. You can always get an easement, or there might already be an easement for view. So the two homeowners can work out a deal. You can even pay them to keep the view, and they'll have an agreement that's legally binding that will be recorded and run with the land for any other person that buys it, right, that says that you have to keep the trees trimmed to X height. The other option is not a lot, but some cities have view ordinances. Okay. So this is more common in coastal cities or maybe some of the more higher income cities. They'll have view ordinances that the city says that you can't have trees of a certain height or blocking someone's view. You see them a lot as HOAs. They have CC&Rs, codes, covenants, or restrictions, and those can have specific view ordinances. That's common in, you get some neighborhoods like, for instance, a golf course, country club type neighborhood where everyone wants to keep their view of the course or whatever else is around there. So you see that sometimes. So if you have none of those options, then you might be out of luck unless the tree is a problem for some other reason. It's a nuisance, the roots are encroaching or whatever. And then there's also this law called spite fence law. And that basically says that someone can't plant a row of trees in the nature of a fence to spite you. Yes. It's a very high standard. It has to be basically malicious. Yes. But there are times, and there's been a few cases on that, where people have purposely planted a row of eucalyptus or some other grand tree just because they don't like their neighbor. They don't like the view. Right. And they just don't want their neighbor to get the view. Right. So, and that can be an actual claim as well. So now, Simon, on that exact point, I was always, we have more like folk legend, but sure, I heard that now they have, let's say they planted a spike row, but then the neighbor above sells and the new neighbor moves in, right, or a new property owner. Yeah. Does that mean they're grandfathered in, or can they still go back and say, hey, that's a spite fence? Yeah, it's, you buy a property, you inherit all the rights and responsibilities for it. So in theory, you would be able to bring that claim. Again, though, we're going to be looking at statute of limitations issues or laches issues if you've delayed asserting those rights. The big problem with the spite fence law is proving it's malicious. Okay. People are always going to claim, I just wanted to put these trees up because I thought they were nice. And you have to prove that they did it, and it's a high standard, so it's a tough one. Well, we got some work to do. Carol, I'm coming for you. All right, we got one more question here that is to Jeremy. What size trunks can be milled into the furniture you spoke about? What are the minimum DBH and lengths that are required? Beautiful question. So everyone thinks the large, majestic redwood is the only thing to mill. We really only need 10 inches. Okay. 10 inches of somewhat straight trunk. And taper has a lot to do with it. So, obviously if it goes much more narrow, you're milled to the smallest diameter. Right. But some of these trees, because especially the ones under power lines that have been taught so many times, the trunk is actually a solid 8 foot of 12, 18 inches wood. Now remember, our chippers can take up to 19 inches, at least our chipper. Sure. But it really takes that planning and that thought process. So what stops this is when you're going throughout your day, nobody's going to stop to harvest 2 pear trees. Right. So with our technology, we see all the work. We have over 1 million trees in our iPhone database, and each of the homeowners can log in and see it. So when we're planning the work, we coordinate with the removal so we can maximize that milling. Sure. It's not so much people don't want it. It's just going, hey, I don't ever have these pears. So we were shocked to see what we can mill. So the benches you guys see in the photos, I believe that's an alder tree that you guys actually had. The top left, those are only 10-inch, 12-inch diameter wood. Wow. It's really not that large. And if you would have saw the trees, it wasn't anything nobody would chain themselves to. Wow. Wow. So it's a beautiful product. In that particular HOA, we installed 5 different benches. Cool. And once again, huge, people love it. Yeah. It's great, sustainable. It's really cool. Okay, guys, we're at an hour, so we're going to finish it off here. Thank you all for joining. If you've got any follow-up questions, our contact info is on the slide. This webinar will be uploaded to our website as well, so feel free to send it to your friends and colleagues and family. Again, Simon Offord, thanks so much. Jeremy, any last words? Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for the time. Appreciate the invite. All right, guys. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Yeah.